Welcome back to another episode of Wuthering Heights, a Reader's Guide. In this video, we're going to be trying to understand Heathcliff, one of the most abrasive, multifaceted, and in my view, misunderstood characters in literature. As with my Catherine analysis, I'll not be focusing on the things that Heathcliff represents, like nature. Instead, I want to look at Heathcliff, the character. I want to try and understand what motivates him, whether he's a hero or a villain, and how should we as readers relate to him. Part 1. Hero or villain? If Heathcliff is a hero, then he's certainly not going to be your traditional, pure, justice-seeking hero. He's often described by literary types as a Byronic hero. The archetype of the Byronic hero was popularised and named after Lord Byron, who was just as famous for his character and personality as his poetry. The Byronic hero is a kind of hero, but it's very different from the traditional idea of a hero that's motivated by justice and morals. He or she can do good things, but generally speaking, they're only going to do good or bad things if it's in their interest. They're not motivated by abstract principles of justice or anything like that. So Superman, probably not going to count as a Byronic hero, but maybe something like Batman would. Now I certainly think that Heathcliff has many of the hallmarks of the Byronic hero. He's certainly mysterious, he comes out of nowhere, he's morally ambiguous to say the least, but Bronte also seems to be making fun of a reader that might try and interpret Heathcliff as a hero at all. At one point in the novel, Heathcliff takes the mick out of Isabella for fancying him. He openly mocks her for picturing me as a hero of a romance and expecting unlimited indulgences from my chivalrous devotion. I can hardly regard her in the light of a rational creature. In the last video, we also looked at how Catherine takes the mick out of Isabella for thinking that Heathcliff is some kind of romantic hero. And so, given that Heathcliff openly mocks someone in the story who is interpreting him as a hero, and given that Catherine does it as well, you can sort of see this maybe as Bronte herself kind of casting doubt on that interpretation of Heathcliff. She seems to be making fun of a reader who would share Isabella's ideas about who Heathcliff is. So it seems like Bronte is trying to encourage us not to interpret Heathcliff as a Byronic hero, or any kind of hero in fact. Now for many readers, and arguably for modern readers, or at least in terms of the videos that I've seen on Heathcliff's character, there's a tendency to interpret him as a villain. And there's certainly good evidence for this. The entire second volume of the story is just loaded with the various things that Heathcliff is doing to get revenge on people. And he does some pretty terrible things. And even before the second volume, he does some pretty terrible things. So there is loads of evidence to suggest that Heathcliff is a villain. And it is also his presence that stops the happy ending from occurring between Cathy and Hareton. It's only when Heathcliff dies that they can have their happy ending. And so that seems to be a sort of villain role, because if you're stopping two characters from having their happy ending, that's usually the role of a villain. Now, Bronte also doesn't poke fun at the idea of Heathcliff being a villain in the way that she does about him being a hero. But to say that Heathcliff is just a through and through villain, that isn't going to wash with me. I don't think that that is the case either. The reason why I think this is because I don't think that anyone in the whole story of Wuthering Heights can be classed as a true villain or a true hero. Nearly all of Bronte's characters, maybe bar a couple, have moments of doing good things, of showing compassion, and they have moments of doing some pretty terrible things. Wuthering Heights is a story not just about Heathcliff being broken and ruining everyone's life, but it's a story about a load of broken people who together ruin each other's lives. Heathcliff just happens to be one of the strongest of the bunch. To call anyone a villain in the traditional sense in this story to me seems wrong, and to call Heathcliff the main villain seems to downplay some of the things that the other characters do, which, even if they're not as extreme as the things Heathcliff does, are arguably just as destructive, if not more so. We've got Catherine, who physically assaults her husband-to-be and manipulates people when they don't do what she wants. We've got Hindley and Francis, who beat up children for fun and then make out afterwards as if it kind of, turns them on to do that. You've got Joseph, who beats children for fun as well. You've got Edgar Linton, who he might not be violent, but does some pretty cruel things, like allowing his sister and then his nephew to be in an environment with an abuser, and thinking that his sister deserves to be with an abuser because she didn't do what he wanted her to do. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much violence in Wuthering Heights, there's so many people doing so many terrible things in Wuthering Heights, that to say that the story has a central villain just seems completely off base. For me then, Wuthering Heights is a story of complex characters who have been abused, and many of them have turned into abusers. And they're all tragic, they're all somewhat heroic in some situations, and in other situations they're quite villainous. But none of them fully fit into either of the categories. And so for Heathcliff being a hero or a villain, he's neither. He's a human being with significant flaws, but he's still a human being. He's not just a one-note villain or a one-note hero. Part 2. Humanising Heathcliff. Like Catherine, Heathcliff gets a lot of flack. In fact, I would say again that in terms of modern readers, there seems to be a stronger tendency to empathise with Catherine and see her as a victim, and to just kind of put most of the blame onto Heathcliff and to not forgive him for the things that he does. But just as in the last video I argued that it's important to recognise that Catherine's character is more complex than the story of her character that we get from Nellie, the same thing applies to Heathcliff. One thing to always remember about Wuthering Heights is that it's being told from a subjective point of view, and it's being told a long time after a lot of these events have occurred. In fact, by the end of the novel, Catherine and Heathcliff seem to have become parts of the folklore of Gimmerton. You've got these stories of two ghosts wandering the moors and children being scared of them. They've certainly become way more than they ever were in life now. They're part of a mythology. And so you really have to be careful when interpreting these characters, because if they've become mythologized, that means that their worst attributes or their strongest attributes are going to be massively exaggerated. And that's why it's really important when you're reading the book to focus on those moments that kind of debunk the mythology around these two characters. Catherine's diary entry is arguably one of the keys to this, because it's something that was written at the time, and it shows you just how horrible the situation was for these two kids growing up. Unfortunately though, we don't get a diary entry from Heathcliff, so we don't really have a moment where we get any of the story that's told from his perspective in his own words. We obviously do get bits where he's speaking, but then he's speaking to Nellie, and so Nellie is remembering the speech, so even that you can't fully trust. Heathcliff's childhood is one that's basically devoid of compassion. As a foundling, he doesn't have anyone there for him when he's at his most vulnerable part of life. He does have a brief moment of kindness when Mr. Earnshaw makes him the favourite, but that doesn't last very long, and once that goes, he's put back into Hindley's care, and things just go from bad to worse. He's eventually cast out, he has no education, he has no one to love him, no one to care for him, and no one to teach him the difference between right and wrong. And when he and Catherine meet the Lintons, Catherine gets taken in by the Lintons. You know, they're both savages, but they choose to dote on Catherine, but they're quite happy just to abandon Heathcliff to his fate. So he never has any moment of redemption as a kid. He never has a moment where someone tries to help him, or at least not in a substantial way. I think it's really important to remember Heathcliff's childhood when we're making judgments about the man that he turns into. I think it's very easy to pass judgment on Heathcliff from the perspective of someone who's had an education, who's been in an environment where you've had parents to teach you the difference from right and wrong. It's very easy to then judge someone who is very immoral and very cruel, like Heathcliff. But the important thing to remember is that Heathcliff has just never had any of that guidance. And so he's basically, in terms of his mental development, the same as a child. He doesn't grow up, he doesn't mature, because there's no one to guide him through that process. And so that's why he remains wild and untamable, and that's why even Catherine eventually turns against him, because she does get, at least for a bit of time, some care, some attention, and some education. In the world that Bronte creates, it's very important for children to have love and care when they're young. If they have that, then they tend to grow into good characters, at least to some extent. But if they don't have that, then they tend to turn into quite savage characters or quite cruel characters, and Heathcliff is the epitome of this. A final reason why I think it's important to empathise with Heathcliff, and I think this applies to Catherine as well, is that these two characters do represent something that I think is inside most people. Catherine and Heathcliff especially are untamable. They are these primitive, bestial type people, and they kind of represent that in all of us. We all have our urges, our kind of cruel desires to do things, but we're quite good at repressing them and controlling them. Heathcliff is just terrible at this. And so sometimes I wonder if the reason why these characters are generally not liked is because people don't really want to think about that aspect of their characters, and they want to kind of dissociate themselves from that side of themselves. But I think Heathcliff and Catherine too are important to empathise with, because I think they do represent something that is inside most people. A primitive side, a violent side, and a cruel side. So it's always important then with Wuthering Heights to remember that it's being told from a subjective point of view. Nellie is biased, and Heathcliff and Catherine and their story has sort of been mythologised. And so it's really hard to know 100% what Heathcliff and what Catherine were really like. My tendency then is to kind of interpret them from a more human perspective and to think about where they've come from and why. And when I do that, I see two people that were abused, never had any love, and in Heathcliff's case, never had any education, and so it's no wonder that he turns into the person that he becomes. Part 3. The sad irony of Heathcliff. When I was reading Wuthering Heights for this series, I realised something for the first time about Heathcliff's character arc, and that it has a really tragic irony in it. At the start of the novel, I think this is in Catherine's diary entry, Catherine and Heathcliff are sick of being abused by Joseph, and they're sick of his religious sermonising. And so Heathcliff and then Catherine throw their Bibles across the floor, kind of rejecting religion in that moment. Because at this point they clearly see Christianity, or at least the Christianity that Joseph preaches, as hypocritical. He preaches love, compassion, but is violent and cruel. In a previous episode, I argued that Joseph represents the Old Testament style of Christianity, which means lots of revenge instead of forgiveness when people do wrong things. And I argued that Wuthering Heights can be interpreted as Bronte trying to convince us to move to the New Testament forgiving sense of morality and away from that Old Testament eye for an eye sense of morality. When Heathcliff throws that Bible away, it seems like he's rejecting this Old Testament way of Christianity. It seems like he doesn't want to be part of this violent, vengeful, punishment-driven system. But the irony is, for Heathcliff and Catherine too, Heathcliff will eventually become just that. He will become the embodiment of revenge in the second volume of the book, when his whole arc is completely consumed with carrying out revenge, not just on the people that wronged him, but the second generations who've done nothing wrong to him. And this really is the epitome of that Old Testament eye for an eye, vengeful God stuff. It's not just you that gets punished, it's the generations and generations that come after too. Ultimately then, the irony of Heathcliff is that he becomes the very thing that he tries to reject at the beginning of the story. In the end, he doesn't reject that vengeful way of thinking. He rejects the God stuff, but he doesn't reject the essence of what Joseph is as a person, which is being vengeful, cruel, and sadistic. Through this, I think Bronte shows us how generations are somewhat predetermined by their upbringings, and that sometimes they are condemned to the same fates as the people that raised them. Heathcliff is unable to escape the cruel upbringing that he has. Instead of truly rejecting it and becoming a good person, he becomes the abuser in the end. Because he has no compassion and no love, he finds it very hard to have these emotions for other people, even Catherine, who he professes to love at times. And because he's raised in this environment where punishment and revenge is par for the course, that's what he'll end up doing in a way that will ultimately destroy both him and Catherine. Part 6, Conclusion. Heathcliff is a really complex character, and there's certainly a lot more to say about him. However, in this video, I think I focused on the things that I think are important when interpreting Heathcliff as a character. For me, Heathcliff is neither a hero or a villain. He represents the story of a victim of abuse who eventually turns tragically into an abuser himself. He also exists in an environment of terrible people who also do terrible things, and so to single him out as the only villain in the story seems to me to be wrong. Instead, he's just very complex, very flawed human being. Like Catherine, his story is somewhat tainted. His story is filtered by Nellie's biases and her memory, and he has become mythologized by the end of the story. Finally, Heathcliff is a really ironic character because he becomes the very thing that he hates as a child. Again, he starts life abused and eventually becomes an abuser himself. But just because he ends up being a terrible person, it doesn't mean that there aren't reasons to empathise with him and try and understand him as a character. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think of Heathcliff the character. Do you think he's a hero or a villain, or do you agree with me that his character is a bit more complex than that? What other things do you find interesting about Heathcliff and his character? What do you think about his relationship to Catherine? I look forward to talking with you about these things and anything else you want to talk about in the comments. But that is it for this video though, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!